From Washington, this is the HPS Macrocast with Hamilton Place Strategies and Markets Policy Partners.
Good morning. It's Friday, November 19th. You're listening to the Macrocast. This is Tony Fratto at Hamilton Place Strategies. We have John Fagan and Brendan Walsh from Markets Policy Partners with us. And we have a special guest today, a former colleague of both mine and John's, the great Stephanie Segal, who is a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I got to know Stephanie when we were working at the Treasury Department together years ago. Stephanie, you actually did a couple stints at Treasury, if I remember, right? You were at Treasury. I think actually when I first met you, you were covering, was it Brazil at that time?
It was Brazil. Yeah. Good memory. Yeah, no, it's been quite a while. I was thinking about this, 20 years pretty much since we've known one another, which is a terrifying fact. But yeah, I was there starting in 2002 and then was back and forth between Treasury and the IMF over the next 15 years. So yeah, started on Brazil, ended on China with a lot of stuff in between.
Co-director of the East Asia office at Treasury. And then your work at CSIS, looking in the economics program. And how would you describe your focus at CSIS right now?
So actually, before I do that, let me just thank you guys for the invitation and say hello to John and Brendan and you. It really is nice to reconnect with you guys, and you do great work. So it's a pleasure to be joining you. So my work at CSIS, we're in the global economics program. So we really have a global mandate. And as we just covered, I'm actually not a China expert by training. I'm more of a Latin Americanist. So I definitely strive to cover issues of global economic import. What that actually translates into, though, and in reality, we do a lot of U.S. China related work. And so I'd say the bulk of my work since I've been there over the last 4 years has been focused on U.S. China economic relations, a lot on U.S. economic competitiveness, but economic competitiveness vis-a-vis China. And then I think, as is true for lots of folks working on economics, have found that our focus is pulled a lot into technology developments. So again, macroeconomist by training, but kind of the reality of what drives macroeconomic outcomes is, the overlap there with technology, innovation, productivity growth is really undeniable. So we've done a lot of work around technology.
There's obviously there's so much to dive into. I definitely want to spend some time talking about especially China. I think I've said in my mind, it has been and will continue to be, I think, the most important bilateral, relationship in the world for the next 50 years is the U.S. China bilateral relationship. And it is an especially challenging time right now on so many fronts, economically and culturally, strategically. So there's just so much going on there. We also wanted to talk about we want to put your macro hat on and talk about the topical story of the time right now, which is inflation. I mean, I feel like all things come back. I feel like it's the 70s again. I get to talk about inflation. Now, it's not 70s style inflation, 70s level of inflation, not as fast as the 70s, but we're all talking about inflation again. Our friend Jason Furman had a terrific piece out yesterday, talking about his view on where the Fed should be going to deal with the current situation. But how are you seeing it? I mean, the debate on where inflation is and where it could go and what the Fed should do and how we should interpret it is pretty complex, but it does boil down to a basic sense also of whether we think it's, it really is transitory and what transitory means right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the transitory point, I almost think the point itself is kind of beside the point, in the sense that I think of inflation, and the discussion around inflation is really about expectations and credibility. And I think that kind of ties into discussions around the Federal Reserve, its role, its independence, its leadership, and kind of composition of the FOMC. As far as where inflation will go, I mean, I think I agree with the analysts that say, anyone that claims to know precisely the direction of inflation is maybe overconfident, because there are so many variables and so many unknowns. And I feel a bit like it's Groundhog's Day, because we've been saying now for the past 20 months that it's really a function of the path of the virus, the effectiveness of technology, so treatments and the vaccines, and then kind of execution on a strategy to contain. And that is all still very true. And the virus itself is still kind of morphing. So, the health outcomes still drive economic outcomes. And so that's kind of the first big variable that complicates, the job of forecasters. The second thing I would say is the role of kind of government policy, both fiscal and monetary. We think there are kind of the two levers there that government authorities actually have control over. And so kind of what is the stance of that policy? We know kind of on the fiscal side, the magnitude of support that's been provided. And now we've had another big fiscal package passed and another one in the pipeline. So I think it makes a lot of sense for folks to be taking into account the impact on demand and the pass through to prices from that fiscal support.
Yeah. And
then there's kind of a separate debate about the structural need for that support, certainly on infrastructure. I don't even think, I don't think there are many skeptics there, right? And now we've got the Build Back Better package that's pending, and kind of the debates about, what the ultimate impact that could be on inflation. That's actually a topic worth debating, but again, another kind of unknown.
Yeah, just lots of unknowns, right? I mean, it could be, even if you just look at Build Back Better, right? What do the support for, family medical leave and child tax credit and, so the sort of family support things do for labor force participation rates, right? Like how do you project that? How do you model that? It's really challenging.
Yeah. And right, it's challenging, and therefore it's worthy of debate. And so for anyone that kind of claims, blanket statement that this is, automatically inflationary, or not for that matter, I think it is absolutely worthy of debate. So on the fiscal side, I think it's a little bit more difficult to assess. I'd say on the kind of the monetary policy side, and I'm really curious to hear what the three of you have to say about that. I mean, I think kind of lost in the discussion is the fact that monetary policy continues to be incredibly supportive. And we're not just talking interest rates, but we're talking kind of asset purchases. And so fine, we're now talking taper, but taper means reducing the size of central bank purchases. That's still very supportive policy. And so lots of folks smarter than I am have been making kind of the suggestion that the pace of the taper, that's something that the Fed could tweak, in particular if inflation pressures kind of remain where they are. And we'll see, with the data that we get next month, but all signs are that the economy remains very strong. I don't suspect that we're going to see any abatement of that inflationary pressure anytime soon. So, should the Fed be looking at tweaking policy and tweaking policy, to go back to where I started, because it's Fed credibility that's on the line, and the Fed needs to be anticipating the risk, not responding to that risk actually materializing. And so, I'm kind of on the side of maybe tweaking that taper policy and giving the Fed a bit more demonstration that it is responding to the price pressures it sees.
When we talk about price pressures, obviously the expectations component is a really key, and it's also very slippery. There are all these different measurements of expectations. There are the ones in the University of Michigan consumer survey. The New York Fed has their own gauge of inflation expectations. And certainly the market, you can see baked in expectations in the TIPS break-even rate, the most cited market-based gauge of inflation expectations. And so all of them look pretty elevated. I think the interesting thought experiment is thinking about Fed credibility from the perspective of financial markets, and the idea that if the Fed were to rhetorically pivot toward a increasingly inflation fighting stance, what would that mean? We've seen some really marginal moves in the center of the committee. Fed Chair Powell has been very, very measured, but even the doves, as we saw New York Fed President Williams yesterday, citing at least a rhetorically tougher line on inflation. Yeah. And what's happened over this period of time, the dollar has rallied to its strongest level since September. We've gotten some, a real response in the front end of the yield curve. The yield curve has, yields have gone up. We've gotten a flattening in the yield curve. We've gotten there's a sense that if the Fed were to do a lot more work on the inflation rhetorically, on inflation fighting rhetorically, at least, the markets certainly are ready to respond. I don't know if that feeds into consumer expectations, but it's easy to see under the current circumstances, I think that these sort of equilibriums in market concern, we're in this sort of unsteady equilibrium phase of inflation concerns, and it's easy to see how that can shift so quickly into growth concerns. We've been toggling between these two for a long period of time.
Well, and it's kind of so market expectations, but then there's also the expectations kind of more at the micro level, right? And this is where we move the inflation debate from economists and market participants to the political realm, and the fact that folks going to the grocery store are actually seeing these price increases, and they're actually experiencing, hopefully, an ability to have more power when it comes to negotiating wages. So they know that they have some ability there to increase their wages, but that in turn can be inflationary. So it's the signaling that you're talking about, John, but it also is kind of the reality of what folks are experiencing on the ground. And certainly those two things end up being connected eventually. But I think, there's a political argument to be made for being kind of responsive to those price pressures as well.
You bring up the micro case, and I wanted to talk about one particular element of the micro case, which is gasoline prices. And we saw earlier this week the summit between Presidents Biden and Xi, and one of the outcomes was not a very loosely coordinated agreement between the two major powers to potentially tap strategic reserves of oil to push back. Is this, so I want to ask a couple of different questions. One is, the sense of oil and gasoline prices as the most sort of visible, salient, hit you right in the pocketbook kind of manifestation, and that's how the Biden administration has addressed that, and your thoughts on that. But also looking at this in the context of the U.S. China Summit, is this potentially energy prices an area where we can find a little common ground? Is this maybe the beginning of something here from your perspective after this call last Monday?
Yeah, I mean, how ironic though, right? Because for the longest time, the issue that was seen as kind of the global public good that could actually unify U.S. and China was climate, and climate in the direction of less carbon intensive energy sources, and here we are the reality and kind of where we are in the energy transformation is one that would have the US and China kind of loosely coordinating on, putting pressure on OPEC, basically. So I think there's a lot in your question that's worthy of discussion. But I think, one, it does point to the fact, looking at the US-China relationship, there are issues where US and Chinese interests are aligned. And let's just say it's kind of energy and climate is one of those issues. And then kind of your second point, I think, is, how the Biden administration, I think you were asking, are they responding to that inflationary pressure and really focusing on the energy piece? Because that's the one that is most immediate and probably most visible. I think absolutely it's hard to kind of interpret it otherwise, in particular because climate has been such a big focus, and yet we kind of face the reality of where we are right now, and there are political calculations needed to respond to the moment in order to achieve some of those longer term goals on climate.
Was there anything else that came out of the summit that you thought was important right now, Stephanie? I mean, how did you read this? I mean, I hesitate to even call it a summit because it seemed like almost a getting to know each other, right? I mean, summit seems too grand a word for what that was. It was like, let's talk about topics right now.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, too grand, and it was over Zoom, right? It was, it was doing what we're doing here today. Yeah. And yet I actually think it was quite a big deal.
Important.
For a couple of reasons. One, you look at the backdrop of how each of the two leaders kind of came into that meeting. So that meeting took place a few hours after President Biden signed the infrastructure bill. And I think lost in the many trillions of dollars of support that we talk about over the last 20 months, I mean, this was a huge accomplishment, right? And I think you guys have talked about this before, but, this was, in excess of $1 trillion spending package on infrastructure that has been the goal of, past administrations that haven't been able to get it off the ground. So it's a really big deal. It was bipartisan, and it gets support to some of these areas that folks have been saying are really critical to our economic future. And so, Biden's whole argument about, the necessity, essential nature of showing that democracies are actually capable of delivering for its people, within a year of becoming president, he delivered on that. So he went into this summit, virtual summit, from a position of strength and having actually accomplished something huge with something else huge still in the pipeline, in the Build Back Better legislation. So President Xi, that's good. President Xi came into this summit having been incorporated into Chinese Communist Party history as one of, kind of three great leaders with this resolution coming out of the CCP, recognizing his role in their history. And so, in terms of accomplishments and coming in from a position of strength, he also came in kind of from a position of really being unrivaled and,
president for life, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
basically.
So
the fact that they were having this summit, having each accomplished things that kind of really established their bona fides, I think should be appreciated, I guess. The second reason why I think it's extremely important, notwithstanding the fact that there weren't a lot in the way of deliverables, is the US and China have not been engaging for years now, and tensions have been escalating. And first kind of among them is around Taiwan and kind of the risks around that. So just the fact that the leaders met over the course of 3+ hours. And then I think that meeting was essential in order to start the more technical meetings that have to take place in order to manage the competition between US and China in a way that keeps us out of kind of a hot conflict. I think that is critical, and, critical not just for folks like us watching US China developments day to day, but, critical for security reasons and to avoid what could be a really big mistake. So I think the summit itself is a pretty big deal. And then, as you pointed out, what specifically came out of it. I think some folks were hoping that, tariff reductions might be discussed. If they were, we didn't get any details on that. I think there was some news about opening up for journalists on both sides, so you kind of can get some of those human connections reestablished. So I think, we can expect to see some incremental progress on specific issues post-summit, but we would never even be able to get to that point unless they'd met in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I am always, pro talking, right? I mean, I'd actually like to see them commit to some kind of regular dialogue, recommit to some regular dialogue to get back to that. At the same time, like the horizon ahead, it looks fraught, right? With you mentioned Taiwan. We still have the trade issues out there. You have issues that get spikes in the relationship that are troubling. Like we saw with the NBA a few years ago. Today it's Peng Shui. Tomorrow it's going to be the Olympics. And, so like there are these regular just, obstacles on the horizon in the relationship. And I agree, like I'd rather they be talking and try to find a way out of it. But it's hard to see how we can have a big impact on some of those things. The Olympics is going to be big. Taiwan is like in it's in its own special giant a dangerous category.
Yeah. Taiwan is its own thing. And I'm always careful to say I'm not an expert in that space, so I can kind of absorb what I see. But Taiwan is its own thing. But I saw the news kind of on the Olympics and, maybe a potential partial boycott. I think when it comes to how the US engages with China and any kind of specific actions we might take, we just published a report about a month ago that establishes a framework for actually evaluating specific activities and whether or not the US and China should engage. And in the event that there is a material risk to engagement, we should be seeing if disengagement actually helps advance US objectives. And that's kind of my biggest takeaway as I look down the list of kind of possible actions the US should take. Those actions should always be honed in on what are we trying to achieve and what's the likelihood that taking an action increases the chances of our desired outcome. So we shouldn't be, just to take an example, we shouldn't be boycotting something for the sake of making a political statement if it doesn't actually help advance our objectives. And sometimes I think that gets lost, that it feels good to bash an adversary. But there's sometimes downsides to taking actions if you don't really know where that's going to lead. And so I do worry sometimes that we're not thinking kind of 3 steps ahead as to what's the likelihood of effectiveness, what's the ultimate outcome of that action. And that's really where we need to be to make good policy. So I hope I hope that's where we end up.
While the engagement with China is maybe getting to a better phase after the summit, well, obviously time will tell. But in the meantime, the U.S. is working on, the Biden administration is focused on policies, and it's something you mentioned before, policies to address U.S. competitiveness and keeping our own house in order as we look into the future. Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill are certainly part of that. But there was the bipartisan bill that the Senate passed earlier this year on competitiveness and U.S. and essentially looked like U.S. industrial policy. I would love to get your take on this bill and the how it was organized, what's your take on its effectiveness and the thesis behind it, and really whether it's going to see the light of day through the House. It's a very interesting piece of legislation from what we've seen.
Yeah, this is the USICA, ugly acronym for it, but the USICA bill. Yeah, I mean, so industrial policy, as you guys know, is kind of having a rebirth, and not just here. I think kind of in Europe and Japan, and kind of characterized as in response to what China already does. But I see it as a recognition of the need to invest in ourselves, and going back to kind of where we started about the amount of time that we spend on technology issues as economists. I think there's a recognition that there are certain foundational technologies and innovations that are going to be the basis for future economic growth. And how you see that manifest in legislation is in USICA, and there the priority is on semiconductors and providing financial support for domestic manufacturers of semiconductors. So the fact that there's kind of that recognition, that there's an identification of sectors that are critical, I think that that's all well and good. But I put a big asterisk next to it. The public sector should not be financing activities that the private sector will already finance. Yep. And so how those resources are channeled, and you can apply this to any number of industries that are deemed to be strategic, right? The public sector shouldn't be crowding out private sector resources. And we certainly, in trying to compete with China, we shouldn't basically adopt Chinese policies, right? So I'm of the view that we benefit from a market-driven economy, and from the fact that we don't have blanket guarantees on certain sectors, and that actually allows for less competitive actors to fail and the more competitive actors to succeed, and that is to our advantage. I was talking with a colleague of mine about the fact that you just look at kind of vaccines and the innovation that took place, building on years worth of work, but US and European developed vaccines are superior. And that is a reflection of how we innovate. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. And so while I'm kind of supportive of identifying strategic sectors, providing support where needed, that support where needed should be where there are market failures, and not, here's a blank check, and not letting market forces work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I always wondered, when I would hear people talk to me about, the things that China is doing, and we need to do those things. And I would say, like, we need to misallocate capital. Is that what you're saying? Like, we need to push capital into lower productive, less productive uses. For what reason exactly?
Yeah.
Just understand what they are actually doing. Yeah.
And it's interesting because you hear, and again, not a technologist, but having talked to experts in technology, you do hear claims that, these technologies, AI, biotech, like there's a difference here in that having the ability to centrally plan advantages the development of those technologies. That's an argument. On the other side of that is actually smaller actors being more nimble. That's what actually advantages, in particular, innovation. And just from kind of personal experience, we've done work looking at foreign research collaboration and heard from U.S. entities that are partnered with Chinese counterparts here, kind of in the academic sphere, their preference to work with those researchers that are not directly affiliated with the government, because that central involvement actually slows down the pace of innovation. So you have anecdotes that I think support kind of the latter version, which is being more nimble and less centrally directed is actually better for competition. But this is another topic that's worthy of debate, because I don't think anyone really knows the answer yet.
No, I don't think it's a slam dunk that way, because look, at the end of the day, you do need, you do need sort of institutional sized, like you're going to end up with institutional sized customers, right? So like winners end up being picked.
Yep.
And they end up being picked by like really big institutional buyers at the end of the day. And that's not always like the very, what some people would consider the very best technology, right? It's like the adaptation becomes the standard, right? So the things become standard that you can then, grow on and develop all kinds of other things on. The sort of standardization of whatever the technology is ends up being the thing.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can't, you can innovate forever, but you need sort of, a market available product, whatever that market is at some point.
Yeah. You're actually reminding me, Tony, of something else that I wanted to make when we talk about U.S. China and kind of what should be the goal of U.S. policy, given how complicated and critical the relationship is. You'll probably remember from our time at Treasury, where we didn't really worry so much what China did necessarily. We had kind of our own policy. I'm thinking here specifically of kind of open investment environments, where we maintain open investment because that is to our advantage. We're not going to worry so much if that's not China's policy or anyone else's policy. I think has changed, and it's a good thing that has changed in the sense that China is, no longer a significantly smaller emerging market economy. It is, by whatever measure you look at, the second largest or the largest economy in the world. Yep. And so to have asymmetries, where our system is open and theirs is closed, that is, one, distortionary to the global economy, but two, I think does disadvantage the United States. So we should be looking for symmetry in our policies, whether it's, FX policy. It doesn't work if one system is floating and the other one is fixed. And similarly on investment and access policy, it doesn't work for the US, but I would say for the global economy to have an open economy and the other largest economy closed. So I would,
I agree. And I think of sort of efforts to get China to see that and understand it as well. Also, that is where the future is going to be. It's needed to be a collaborative effort from like-minded economies, right? With United States and Europe working together, United States and non-China East Asia or Asia working, Pacific Rim working together, which was TPP and our efforts with Europe. And is that possible? Because we can't force China to do it alone.
Not at all. We can't force China to do anything.
Anything.
Just like China can't really force us to do anything. I think, we act and they act in self-interest, as do the Europeans, it is,
nation states doing their thing.
Exactly, which is all well and good. But I think where you were going is the US working with Europe, with Australia, with Japan, with allies and partners actually makes a much more convincing case that it would be in China's self-interest to actually adhere to certain global standards. And that applies, whether we're talking about policies around subsidies. And I would say, given our discussion on industrial policy, it's transparency around those policies that's really essential. Or if we're talking about, climate's another one where there really needs to be a high price put on those that are not kind of getting behind, the transformation that has to take place. So the only way to get there, I'm just in agreement with you, is to be working with other countries to apply that pressure and to stay, on the same page. And that is no small task. But I think, clearly the intention is there, and there have been steps in that direction. There's this U.S. Trade and Tech Council that, plants the seeds for that sort of coordination and cooperation. So we just need to see where it goes from here.
Are you optimistic on that front?
I am clear-eyed, but optimistic. I think it's going to be really hard. I think the administration's appeal to values is important. I think, folks are sometimes dismissive of, values as an organizing principle, but I think reminding our allies and partners and ourselves that there are certain things that actually do unify us, democracy being kind of first and foremost among them, that is a good organizing principle. And reminding us of that actually maybe helps us compromise where we need to, because I think both sides are going to have to compromise.
I agree. Stephanie, it's been such a great joy to have you on. It was like the fastest 45 minutes I think we've ever had on this show.
Well,
can we have you back one of these days?
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's great. Yeah. It's great really to see all of you guys. And like I said, I've listened to your podcast. You always have, insightful and clear discussions, which I really appreciate. And I think is much needed. So happy to come back whenever you invite me.
Well, I promise you we will take you up on that, because we'd absolutely love to have you back. And there's so many things to talk about. We probably could have done a full 2 hours on these things. But thanks so much for joining us today. I know on behalf of John and Brendan and the podcast team here, thanks so much, and we'll definitely have you back. And guys, have a great weekend.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Macrocast. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and share.